Welcome back to the Camilla Tominey Show. As you can see, look, I'm holding up this book. Alexander Lohmann, the author of this great book, The Windsors at War, put my teeth in, joins me now. And this is so intriguing because a lot has been said and written about Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson's sympathy for the Nazis. Characterise it for me. I mean, they were appeasers. Were they Hitler fans? And were they affiliated with groups like the Black Shirts? How far did it go?
Well, I think it's fair to say that Wallis wasn't that political, but Edward was a massive fan of Hitler. I mean, he went to meet him in Germany in 1937, and ostensibly he was there to see the industrial progress of the country since the First World War. But in fact, he admired Hitler a huge amount. I mean, later in life, he even said he never thought Hitler was such a bad chap.
Right, so even later in life he didn't acknowledge the foolishness and folly of his links to Germany back in the late 30s.
He was never a man who was into... I mean, he was incredibly foolish and his whole life was folly, but he never acknowledged that.
You are quite scathing about him as a person. Characterise him for us, Edward VIII, because you're not flattering in this book.
I'm very scathing about him as a person. I think he's probably one of the worst men ever to have been king, because he was so self-obsessed and so selfish and so venal that every single action of his, including the treacherous ones, have to be seen through the prism of somebody who believed that there was nothing in life that he didn't deserve and didn't merit. And you think, I mean, is that what everybody thinks when they become king? I mean, under the surface, is that genuinely that you think you can do whatever you like? Because he certainly did. And if you read all his letters, I mean, it's astonishing. You keep thinking, you're like a Bond villain or something.
Really? And then I suppose a lot is said in a negative way about Wallis Simpson, but actually she comes out better in the relationship than he does. You know, perhaps it was misogynistic at the time, blame the American divorcee, when actually he's the one who's got major character flaws.
I think so, and I think Wallis has been unfairly maligned over the years, and there's been a lot of sexism talks about her as well. I mean, she was certainly somebody who liked the finer things in life, but I don't think of her as a bad person, just somebody who was selfish like him. But he was certainly somebody who, I mean, we look at the present day Duke and Duchess of Sussex, and we can see there are a fair number of parallels, actually.
I was wondering if you were going to go there. You've done it. This will create a Twitter storm, just to warn you. But are there parallels? I mean, it would be quite cruel, wouldn't it, to compare Prince Harry to Edward VIII, because you've been so scathing about him. But
what's interesting at one point is the Duke of Windsor says that he wants to bat away the impertinent suggestion that I'm a publicity seeker. And as soon as I read that in one of his letters, I thought that's exactly what Harry keeps saying, but I don't want all this publicity, I don't want to be the public eye all the time. And I'm thinking, for a man who doesn't want to be the public eye, you're giving a very, very good account of being constantly in the media.
When they were exiled to the Bahamas, what did they actually do? Because the book also speaks to huge periods of boredom where they're both there just twiddling their thumbs, completely away from the royal scene, sort of effectively perhaps making trouble.
Well, they were sent to the Bahamas because they were such trouble, and because Edward's obviously Nazi sympathies meant that his being in Europe meant the whole thing was really, really impossible. But obviously, what I find incredibly funny is that he goes to the Bahamas, you know, thousands of miles away from where it's thought he can cause trouble, and he meets Nazi sympathisers there, which shows a real dedication to seeking out the worst people you can imagine.
How badly do you think this reflects on George VI and indeed Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother? I mean, actually, her portrayal isn't entirely favourable either in this book.
Well, it's interesting because I tried to be fair and balanced about everybody, and certainly the king was somebody who, until he got into his stride in the Second World War, he was really floundering. I mean, he was really unable, because he never wanted to be king, and it's very much thrust upon him. And his wife, I mean, she's tough, and that's what we forget, because we have this idea of the Queen Mother as a sort of lovable, gin-drinking, you know, auntie. But in fact, when you see how she had to run the royal household, and she was very much in charge of the king, she was practically the power behind the throne herself. So we can see that Edward and Wallis and George and Elizabeth, it's very much the woman in charge in both situations.
Can we clear up a degree of confusion about their links to the Germans in the late 30s, and indeed this notion that initially George VI and his wife did support Hitler? Is that taking it too far?
Yes, I think that's definitely taking it too far. I mean, what's fair to say is that George and I suppose the Queen were both supporters of appeasement, because George was a man who I think always wanted father figures, and Neville Chamberlain, the then Prime Minister, and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary.
Yeah, there was a controversy over Chamberlain appearing on the Buckingham Palace balcony, for instance.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that everybody thought that war with Germany was the worst possible thing that could happen. And so people were bending over backwards to appease Hitler. And so the king was very much thinking all this time, we've got to appease Hitler. But his private secretary, Alec Harding, whose diaries I use it his diaries and letters I use in the book for the first time, he knew it was a bad idea because he'd fought in the First World War, and he could say, this is just going to lead to absolute devastation. There is no possibility with a man like Hitler that we can actually seek peace terms with him.
So there's a distinction then, it seems to me, between George VI talking about appeasement in terms of trying to find peace in Europe, and Edward VIII, his brother, talking about appeasement because he actually supported Hitler, and that's where that line is drawn. There was once an image, I don't know if you remember it, Alexander, of the Queen, Elizabeth II, appearing to Nazi salute alongside her sister, Princess Margaret. Much was made of that. It was the front page of the Sunday Express some years ago. What do you make of that? Were they play acting? What was going on there?
What I make of that is that they were doing it as a joke. I mean, they were too young to understand the import of it. And obviously, this was a long time before the Second World War. I mean, they were certainly not doing it with any kind of sympathy. Edward, on the other hand, knew exactly what he was doing. And it's interesting because there's often been a lot of debate about was he giving Nazi salutes right, left and centre. I think the answer is almost certainly. I mean, the fact that we have these images of him looking very, very happy doing so. I mean, I think he would have liked to have come back to Britain as a kind of puppet dictator. I think he genuinely would have relished the idea of being king with Hitler as a kind of president of the United States of Europe.
Good grief. And on Churchill, let's just very briefly discuss his relationship with both Edward VIII and then latterly with George VI.
Well, it's interesting because Churchill was a great supporter of Edward VIII during the abdication crisis, but as the war went on, it's quite funny because there's actually a draft of a letter in which Churchill explicitly says the Duke's allegiances are known to be pro-Nazi, and you think, that's a fairly astonishing thing to say about a man who used to be king. But his relationship with George VI was much better because it began with a level of mutual distrust, but eventually it became this very close working partnership, which continued after the war and after Churchill stopped being Prime Minister.
You could even say perhaps it was a brotherly relationship in the absence of Edward VIII, that actually George VI needed to turn to someone, and in the end it was Churchill, and they formed this extraordinary alliance that helps the war effort.
And I think that, that image of the King and Churchill standing next to each other on VE Day, it's a great, it's a great powerful image because we see exactly what happened between them, and we see the King and the Prime Minister working very harmoniously.
Alexander Lahmann, thank you very much. You can check out his book here, look. It's brilliant and you should get a copy.